My lake got drained because it was too full. That's not a joke. According to my HOA, a perfectly calm, spring-fed lake was somehow an imminent flood threat. Their solution? Industrial pumps and zero shame. One day I had herons and kayaks, the next, a crater in a letter quoting bylaws like scripture. Apparently, my lake offended their sense of suburban dryness. Ever seen nature get evicted? Stick around. If your HOA has ever tried to outlaw common sense or declare war on water, I need to hear about it. Drop your wildest HOA horror story in the comments, especially if it involved ducks, drainage, or someone named Pamela. Let me paint you the picture. After 15 years maintaining urban ecosystems for the state park system, I thought I'd found paradise. This wasn't just any lake. It was a pristine 40-acre natural basin fed by underground springs, surrounded by mature oaks and willows. The water was so clear, you could see bass swimming 20 feet down. Herons would wade in the shallows at dawn, and families of ducks raised their young in the protected coves. I bought the property specifically because it came with lake rights dating back to 1896. This was my retirement dream, a place where I could fish at sunrise, kayak in the evenings, and finally have some peace after dealing with bureaucrats and city councils for decades. The trouble started exactly 3 weeks after I moved in. I was sitting on my dock, coffee in hand, watching the morning mist rise off the water, when I heard the unmistakable sound of high heels clicking across gravel. That's when I first laid eyes on Pamela Rushford. Picture a woman in her late 30s, wearing a crisp white blazer at 8 in the morning, carrying a leather folder, like she was about to foreclose on someone's grandmother. Her hair was pulled back like a corporate weapon, and the folder screamed foreclosure energy. She introduced herself as the president of the Willowbrook Community Association and handed me an official-looking letter with more letterhead than actual content. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It claimed that my lake posed an imminent flood risk to the community and demanded that I drain it within 30 days or face legal action. Now, I'd spent my entire career studying water systems, flood patterns, and environmental impact assessments. This lake had been stable for over a century, with natural overflow channels that prevented any possibility of flooding. The whole thing was absurd, but Pamela delivered it with the confidence of someone reading a weather report. She explained that the community had voted, though she couldn't specify when or who exactly had voted, and that my compliance was non-negotiable for the safety of all residents. I tried reasoning with her, explaining the lake's natural drainage system and showing her the geological surveys that came with my property deed. But Pamela had this way of tilting her head and smiling whenever someone disagreed with her, like she was humoring a particularly slow child. She cut me off mid-sentence, saying, "Mr. Barnett, you clearly don't understand how things work around here. This community has standards, and your little pond doesn't meet them." The way she said "little pond" while staring at my beautiful lake made my jaw clench, but I kept my cool. After all, I was the new guy, and maybe this was some misunderstanding that could be resolved with facts and common sense. Boy, was I wrong. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for noon that Saturday in the community pavilion, a concrete structure that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated architecture. About 20 residents showed up, most of them clutching coffee cups and looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Pamela stood at the front with a flip chart that would have made a used car salesman proud, complete with hand-drawn diagrams of flood zones and property value impact. She painted a picture of impending doom, claiming that my lake would somehow cause their basements to flood, their property values to plummet, and probably summon locusts while it was at it. The presentation was theater at its finest. Pamela had clearly done her homework on these people. She knew that Mrs. Henderson from Maple Street was worried about her rose garden, so she suggested the lake would increase humidity and cause fungal diseases. She told the retired couple from Oak Avenue that the lake would attract mosquitoes and lower their home's resale value. Every concern was ridiculous from a scientific standpoint, but Pamela delivered each point with the authority of someone who'd never let facts get in the way of a good argument. When I stood up to explain the actual hydrology of the situation, she smiled that cold smile and said, "Cole, honey, you don't really belong here yet, do you? Let the people who've invested in this community make the decision." That's when I realized this wasn't about flood risk or property values. This was about control. Pamela had built her little kingdom, and my lake represented something she couldn't regulate, couldn't fine, couldn't manage into submission. The vote was a foregone conclusion, 15 in favor of draining, 3 abstentions, and me as the lone dissenter. As the meeting broke up, I watched my neighbors file out without making eye contact, and I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood. My hands were shaking with frustration, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned long ago that showing weakness to bullies only makes them stronger. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched helplessly as contractors hired by the HOA began the process of draining my lake. They installed massive pumps that ran 24 hours a day, creating a constant mechanical whine that drowned out the natural sounds I'd moved here to enjoy. The water level dropped inch by agonizing inch, exposing the muddy banks and stranding the wildlife that had called this place home. But while Pamela thought she was teaching me a lesson about community compliance, I was learning something entirely different. I was studying the HOA bylaws, researching property law, and discovering how many corners Pamela had cut to get her way. The woman who'd made my lake disappear had no idea that she'd given me something much more powerful than standing water. She'd given me motivation. And as I sat in my empty dock chair, staring at the muddy crater where my lake used to be, Pamela thought she'd drained my lake. But I still had something that could get a lot wetter than she'd bargained for. The morning after the lake was officially drained, I was sitting on my now useless dock when Caleb Bradley walked up with 2 cups of coffee and a grin that suggested he knew something I didn't. Caleb ran a mobile mechanic business out of his garage and had the kind of practical wisdom that comes from fixing things that matter. He handed me a coffee and said, "Welcome to the Pamela Rushford experience, buddy. Hope you brought your sense of humor, because you're going to need it." That's when he told me about the great signage war of 2022. Apparently, Caleb had made the mistake of putting up a small business sign in his front yard. Nothing flashy, just a simple wooden sign that read, "Bradley Mobile Mechanics," with his phone number. Within a week, he'd received a citation for excessive commercial advertising and a demand to remove what Pamela called an eyesore that degrades neighborhood aesthetics. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd turned my pristine lake into a mud pit was concerned about eyesores. Caleb fought the citation for 3 months, attending meeting after meeting, until the HOA threatened to put a lien on his house. He finally gave up and moved his sign to the back of his property, but the experience had taught him everything he needed to know about Pamela's methods. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to test the boundaries of Pamela's authority. Jake's old fishing boat was still tied up from last summer, floating in the last scraps of public water. I took it out for a slow glide, the motor barely a whisper, pretending for one morning that my lake hadn't become a construction graveyard. That afternoon, I found another letter from the HOA taped to my front door. This one was even more creative than the first. According to Pamela's latest legal masterpiece, my unauthorized watercraft operation was creating noise pollution and environmental degradation in violation of community standards. The letter went on to explain that as a resident of Willowbrook, all of my activities, even those on public property, were subject to HOA oversight. I had to admire the audacity. Pamela was claiming that joining the HOA meant surrendering my constitutional rights anywhere within a 5-mile radius of the neighborhood. I decided to call her bluff. The next morning, I loaded Jake's boat with a portable speaker and spent 3 hours slowly circling the remaining water while reading the HOA bylaws out loud through a megaphone. I used my best golf announcer voice, complete with dramatic pauses and editorial commentary. States Robert MacArthur, Section 5, which prohibits state laws of allowing cabins or yards, or even public yards, to be cut. Article 1, Section 3, states that all landscaping modifications require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Now, folks, you might be wondering what constitutes landscaping when you've drained someone's lake. Stay tuned for the thrilling conclusion of Article 7, Section 4, which covers the exciting topic of fence height regulation. The performance was partially for my own amusement, but mostly to draw attention to what Pamela was doing. If she wanted to play games with bureaucracy, I'd show the whole neighborhood exactly what their HOA president was capable of. By the second day of my floating reading sessions, I had an audience. Soon folks lingered with their dogs, lawn chairs popped up, and Mrs. Martinez made it her new coffee ritual. For once, I wasn't the HOA's problem. I was the neighborhood's entertainment. But Pamela wasn't about to let me turn her power play into community theater. She escalated by hiring a construction crew to repair flood damage to the lake's banks, damage that had been caused by her own draining operation. The crew showed up with bulldozers and backhoes, ostensibly to stabilize the shoreline for community safety. What they did was destroy the last remnants of the natural landscape I'd fallen in love with. Ancient willows that had been growing for decades were pushed over and hauled away. The gentle slopes that had been perfect for wildlife access were carved into harsh, geometric angles that looked like they belonged in a strip mine. The destruction was heartbreaking, but it was also strategic. Pamela knew that every tree that fell was another piece of my dream being torn away. She started spreading rumors around the neighborhood that I was emotionally unstable and had been making threats about the lake situation. According to Pamela's version of events, my morning boat rides were reconnaissance missions for some kind of environmental terrorism. The woman had turned my peaceful protest into evidence of mental instability, and some of my neighbors were buying it. The social isolation was harder to deal with than the bureaucratic harassment. People who had waved from their porches now crossed the street when they saw me coming. The friendly dog walker who used to stop and chat about the weather suddenly found urgent business elsewhere whenever I appeared. Pamela had managed to turn me into the neighborhood pariah without ever having to prove a single one of her accusations. It was a masterclass in small-town character assassination, and I had to admit it was working. But while Pamela was busy destroying my reputation, I was busy researching hers. My lawyer friend Neil Granger had recommended a deep dive into HOA governance, and what I found was fascinating. Pamela had been cutting corners on proper notification procedures, bypassing required waiting periods, and making unilateral decisions that should have required full board approval. More importantly, I discovered that the HOA owned several undeveloped lots throughout the neighborhood, lots that were purchased as community green space but had never been developed or maintained. One of these lots was directly adjacent to Pamela's house, and according to the public records, it was available for purchase by any community member willing to pay fair market value. I spent that evening sitting in my car staring at the empty lot next to Pamela's perfectly manicured lawn, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something besides frustration. I felt possibility. Pamela had taught me that in Willowbrook, the person who controlled the land controlled the narrative. She'd used that power to drain my lake and turn my neighbors against me, but she'd also shown me something she probably didn't intend to reveal. The HOA owned property, which meant the HOA could sell property. And if I owned property right next to hers, well, that would make me a different kind of neighbor than she'd bargained for. As I drove home past the muddy crater where my lake used to be, I smiled. Pamela didn't know it yet, but she'd given me the perfect spot for my next project. The purchase of the lot next to Pamela's house was surprisingly straightforward. According to HOA bylaws, any community member could buy undeveloped HOA property at appraised value, provided they submitted a development plan within 30 days. I submitted my application on a Monday morning, along with a certified check and a beautifully formatted proposal for a community ecological restoration zone. The language was deliberately vague, but technically accurate. I planned to restore the natural wetland ecosystem that had existed on the property before suburban development. What I didn't mention was that wetlands are basically swamps with better marketing. The lot was perfect for my purposes. It was a half-acre parcel that sat slightly lower than the surrounding properties, with natural clay soil that held water like a bathtub. Previous owners had tried to build on it twice, but both attempts had been abandoned due to drainage issues. The HOA had eventually acquired it for unpaid taxes and let it sit vacant for over a decade. Pamela's house was positioned so that her kitchen window looked directly across the property, giving her a clear view of whatever I decided to do with it. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. She'd get to watch my project develop from the same spot where she'd probably planned her campaign against my lake. I hired a surveyor to mark the boundaries and confirm the elevation, then started the permitting process with the county. The beauty of creating a wetland restoration project was that it fell under environmental protection laws, which meant it was almost impossible to stop once properly authorized. I filed every environmental permit I could find: wetland easement, habitat restoration, flood control. It was a mountain of red tape. But if Pamela could use rules as weapons, I could turn them into armor. The first sign that Pamela was paying attention came 3 days after I posted my development notice. She marched over to my property with a clipboard and that familiar tight smile, clearly prepared for battle. "Cole, sweetie," she said, using the condescending tone that had become her trademark, "I'm afraid there's been some confusion about your little project. The community has standards, and swampland doesn't really fit our aesthetic vision." I almost laughed at the irony. The woman who'd turned my beautiful lake into a mud pit was lecturing me about aesthetics. What Pamela didn't know was that I'd done my homework on her past decisions. Buried in the HOA meeting minutes from 3 years earlier was a resolution she'd championed called the Green Space Preservation Initiative. The resolution specifically encouraged native habitat restoration and environmentally sustainable landscaping throughout the community. Pamela had pushed it through as part of a tax incentive program, probably never imagining that someone would use it. When I pulled out a copy of the resolution with her signature at the bottom, her smile faltered for the first time since I'd met her. "This is different," she said, but her voice had lost some of its authority. "That resolution was meant for gardens and parks, not whatever this is." I explained that according to the county's environmental assessment, my property was historically wetland and that restoration would improve drainage for the entire neighborhood. The technical details seemed to confuse her, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Pamela was used to intimidating people with bureaucracy, but she'd never dealt with someone who understood environmental science better than she understood HOA politics. The next phase of her attack was more predictable. She called an emergency board meeting for the following Thursday, sending out notices that barely met the minimum legal requirement. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. About 15 residents showed up, most of them looking like they'd been personally recruited by Pamela. She'd prepared another presentation, this one featuring aerial photos of swamps, with dramatic captions about property values and mosquito-borne diseases. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pamela announced, "we're here today because one of our residents has decided to create a breeding ground for pests and predators right in the heart of our community." She clicked through slides showing alligators, snakes, and clouds of insects as if I was planning to import them directly from the Everglades. The fear-mongering was impressive in its creativity, if not its accuracy. According to Pamela's presentation, my modest wetland restoration would somehow attract every dangerous creature in North America while simultaneously destroying everyone's property values. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I explained that the project had full county approval, that it would improve local drainage, and that the plants I was installing were native species that had been growing in the area for thousands of years. I showed photos of similar restoration projects that had increased property values and reduced flooding in nearby communities. But facts were no match for fear, and Pamela had spent weeks preparing her audience for this moment. The vote was closer than I'd expected, 8 in favor of blocking my project, 6 against, with 1 abstention. But the victory was hollow for Pamela, because she'd overlooked a crucial detail. The HOA could vote to disapprove of my project, but they couldn't stop it. I owned the land, I had the permits, and my plans fell under state environmental protection laws that superseded local regulations. Her vote was meaningless, a fact that became clear when I thanked everyone for their input and announced that construction would begin the following Monday, regardless of their decision. The look on Pamela's face was worth 6 months of HOA harassment. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely surprised. She'd played the same game she'd used to drain my lake, rally the neighbors, hold a vote, and steamroll the opposition with bureaucratic authority. But this time, she'd run up against laws that were bigger than her little kingdom. As the meeting broke up, I heard her telling the other board members that she was exploring legal options to stop my project. That's when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. Walking home that night, I could see the lights on in Pamela's kitchen window. She was probably sitting at her table, surrounded by HOA bylaws and legal documents, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. Meanwhile, I had a crew of environmental restoration specialists showing up Monday morning with native plants, permeable barriers, and everything else needed to turn a vacant lot into a functioning wetland ecosystem. Pamela thought she was fighting Cole Barnett, the new guy who didn't understand community standards. What she didn't realize was that she was fighting Mother Nature, and Mother Nature had lawyers. While Pamela was busy researching ways to stop my wetland project, I was making friends with someone who knew where all the HOA bodies were buried. Martha Dunning had been one of the original founders of the Willowbrook Community Association back in 2008, but she'd been systematically pushed out of leadership roles by Pamela over the past few years. Martha was a retired elementary school teacher with the kind of institutional memory that made her dangerous to anyone who'd been cutting corners. Martha approached me at the grocery store, of all places, while I was loading bags of native plant fertilizer into my truck. She was a small woman in her early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd spent decades dealing with difficult children and incompetent administrators. "You're Cole Barnett," she said, not really asking, "the one with the wetland project?" When I confirmed her guess, she smiled for the first time in our brief conversation. "Good. Pamela's been running this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom for too long. Maybe it's time someone reminded her that the HOA is supposed to serve the community, not the other way around." What Martha told me over coffee that afternoon was both enlightening and infuriating. Pamela hadn't been making unilateral decisions about community policy. She'd been using HOA funds for personal projects. The biggest example was a contract with her nephew's web design company to create a neighborhood website. The project had cost the HOA over $8,000, but the website was a glorified blog that Pamela used to post community announcements and photos of her garden. Even worse, Martha had evidence that Pamela had been skimming money from the web design budget to pay for personal landscaping at her own house. The financial irregularities went beyond simple embezzlement. Pamela had been awarding maintenance contracts to companies owned by her friends and family members, often without competitive bidding. She'd used HOA funds to pay for legal consultations that were about her personal property disputes. Most recently, she'd hired a community relations consultant who turned out to be her divorce attorney, billing the HOA for advice on how to handle difficult residents like me. Martha had been documenting these irregularities for months, but she'd been waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came sooner than either of us expected. While Martha was gathering evidence of Pamela's financial misconduct, Pamela was escalating her campaign against my wetland project. She'd decided that legal challenges weren't moving fast enough, so she was switching to more direct methods. The first sign of trouble came when I arrived at my property Monday morning to find that someone had dumped construction debris in the middle of my restoration site. Broken concrete, rusty rebar, and chunks of asphalt had been scattered across the area where I planned to install native plants. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The debris dump had happened over the weekend when no one would be around to witness it. More importantly, the specific location of the dump showed that whoever did it knew exactly where my sensitive planting areas were located. I'd only shared those details with the county permitting office and the HOA board, which meant the vandalism had come from someone with inside information. I filed a police report and installed motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of the property, but I had a feeling this was the beginning. My suspicions were confirmed the following Thursday when Pamela organized what she called a community garden party in the park adjacent to my wetland project. Pamela timed her garden party to sabotage my planting day. 20 residents showed up with snacks and side-eyes. My restoration had become her latest spectacle. Pamela had even hired a local musician to provide entertainment, creating a festival atmosphere that made my environmental work look like an invasion. But the real purpose of the party became clear when Pamela started her informal presentation to the gathered crowd. Standing on a portable stage that had been set up for the occasion, she began what could only be described as character assassination disguised as community concern. According to Pamela's version of events, I was a disruptive influence who was intentionally attracting vermin to the neighborhood. She claimed that my boat rides on the drained lake had been reconnaissance missions for the wetland project, and that I was planning to create a breeding ground for mosquitoes and snakes right next to children's play areas. The performance was masterful in its manipulation. Pamela knew that most of her audience didn't understand the difference between a restored wetland and a stagnant swamp, so she painted a picture of environmental catastrophe that would have made a disaster movie producer proud. She talked about property values plummeting, insurance rates skyrocketing, and families being forced to move away from the neighborhood they'd invested in. By the time she finished speaking, half the crowd was looking at me like I was personally responsible for the decline of Western civilization. What made the situation even more frustrating was that I couldn't defend myself without sounding defensive. Every time I tried to explain the science behind wetland restoration, Pamela would interrupt with another emotional appeal about community safety and property values. She'd perfected the art of making reasonable explanations sound like excuses, and her audience was eating it up. By the end of the evening, I felt like I'd been tried and convicted in the court of suburban public opinion. That's when Martha decided to make her move. She'd been sitting in the back of the crowd, quietly recording everything on her phone, and she'd heard enough. As the party was winding down and people were packing up their chairs, Martha stood up and asked Pamela a simple question. Could you explain to everyone here how you justified spending $8,000 of HOA funds on a website that only you can update? The question hung in the air like a smoke bomb, and suddenly everyone's attention shifted from my supposed crimes to Pamela's real ones. The silence that followed was deafening. Pamela's confident smile faltered as she realized that her past was catching up with her present. She tried to deflect by claiming that community website development was a legitimate HOA expense, but Martha was ready with documentation. She'd brought copies of the invoices, the contract with Pamela's nephew, and bank records showing payments to companies that existed only on paper. As Martha methodically laid out the evidence of financial misconduct, the crowd that had been ready to run me out of town began to shift their focus to their HOA president. Pamela packed her stage in a silent panic, while Martha handed out copies of the evidence like flyers at a protest. Neighbors huddled, no longer whispering, now they were angry. For the first time, the tide wasn't just turning, it was crashing. Pamela had made the mistake of assuming that her community was as gullible as she was corrupt. But Martha had proven that even the most effective manipulator can be undone by simple facts and good documentation. The transformation of my lot from vacant land to functioning wetland happened faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks, I had native cattails growing in the shallow water areas, willows taking root along the edges, and a small boardwalk that allowed visitors to observe the ecosystem without disturbing it. The county environmental office had been so impressed with the project that they'd featured it in their monthly newsletter as an example of successful community conservation. Local biology students from the community college had started using it as a field study site, and I'd even been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include it in a project about urban habitat restoration. But the real validation came from an unexpected source: the wildlife. Within days of completing the initial planting, I started seeing species that hadn't been in the neighborhood for years. A pair of great blue herons took up residence in the shallow water areas, and families of red-winged blackbirds nested in the cattails. Wood ducks began stopping by during their migration, and I even spotted a family of muskrats that had apparently moved in from the state park. The sight of wild animals thriving just 50 yards from suburban backyards was exactly what I'd hoped to achieve. The success of the project drove Pamela to increasingly desperate measures. She'd been monitoring my progress from her kitchen window, and the sight of actual wildlife in her perfectly controlled neighborhood seemed to trigger something primal in her need for dominance. Her first counterattack came in the form of anonymous complaints to the county health department, claiming that my wetland was creating a public health hazard due to standing water and uncontrolled animal population. When the health inspectors arrived for their investigation, they found a thriving ecosystem that exceeded all safety and environmental standards. But Pamela's complaints kept coming. The breakthrough moment came on a Tuesday morning when I was doing routine maintenance on the boardwalk. I'd installed trail cameras around the perimeter of the property, partly for research purposes and partly to document any potential vandalism. What I captured instead was Pamela herself, creeping around the edges of my wetland at dawn with a bottle of what appeared to be pesticide. The footage was crystal clear: Pamela pouring chemicals into the water where I'd planted sensitive native species, then quickly retreating back to her house. The irony was breathtaking. The woman who'd claimed to be protecting the community from environmental hazards was literally poisoning a conservation project. But what made it even better was that Pamela had unknowingly committed a federal crime. Dumping chemicals in a protected wetland was a violation of the Clean Water Act, punishable by significant fines and potential criminal charges. I had her dead to rights, and the evidence was so clear that even the most sympathetic judge couldn't overlook it. I spent that afternoon making copies of the video footage and preparing a detailed report for the appropriate authorities. The County Environmental Office, the State Fish and Wildlife Department, and the Federal EPA all received copies of the evidence, along with documentation of the damage to the restoration project. Within 48 hours, Pamela was facing investigations from 3 different government agencies, and the story had been picked up by the local news. The media attention was exactly what I'd hoped for, but not for the reasons you might expect. Instead of focusing on the legal drama, the news coverage highlighted the success of the wetland restoration project and its benefits to the community. The local TV station did a feature story about urban conservation efforts, interviewing residents who'd been enjoying the wildlife viewing opportunities. The newspaper ran an editorial praising community-led environmental initiatives and criticizing HOA overreach. Suddenly, my project wasn't just about wetland restoration, it had become a symbol of grassroots environmental activism. The shift in public opinion was dramatic and immediate. Neighbors who'd been avoiding me for weeks started stopping by to see the wetland and ask questions about the wildlife. Children from the elementary school began coming by with their parents to watch the herons and learn about native plants. The community college asked if they could install an educational kiosk to help visitors understand the ecological importance of wetland habitat. What had started as my personal revenge project had accidentally become a beloved community resource. But the real victory came when Martha organized what she called an emergency board meeting to address Pamela's conduct. Unlike Pamela's carefully orchestrated community events, this meeting was attended by residents who were genuinely concerned about HOA governance and financial accountability. Martha had spent weeks building a coalition of neighbors who were tired of Pamela's authoritarian management style, and they'd come prepared with documentation of her various abuses of power. The meeting was held in the same community center where Pamela had tried to rally opposition to my wetland project, but this time she was the one on trial. Martha presented evidence of the financial irregularities, the unauthorized use of HOA funds, and the pattern of retaliatory behavior against residents who dared to question Pamela's decisions. When the video of Pamela poisoning my wetland was shown, the reaction from the crowd was a mixture of shock and disgust. Several residents stood up to share their own stories of harassment and intimidation, painting a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond my individual case. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Even the board members who'd been Pamela's closest allies couldn't defend her actions in the face of overwhelming evidence. Pamela tried to maintain her composure as the votes were counted, but I could see her hands shaking as she realized that her reign as HOA queen was coming to an end. The woman who'd tried to drain my lake and destroy my wetland was about to lose everything she'd worked to build. As the meeting ended and people began filing out, Pamela made one last attempt to salvage her reputation. She approached me with what she probably thought was a conciliatory smile and said, "Cole, I hope you understand that everything I did was for the good of the community. Maybe we can work together going forward." The audacity was remarkable. She was trying to rewrite history, even as the consequences of her actions were crashing down around her. I looked at her for a long moment, then smiled and said, "Pamela, I think your definition of community service is a little different from mine." She didn't have an answer for that. The transformation of my lot from vacant land to functioning wetland happened faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks, I had native cattails growing in the shallow water areas, willows taking root along the edges, and a small boardwalk that allowed visitors to observe the ecosystem without disturbing it. The county environmental office had been so impressed with the project that they'd featured it in their monthly newsletter as an example of successful community conservation. Local biology students from the community college had started using it as a field study site, and I'd even been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include it in a project about urban habitat restoration. But the real validation came from an unexpected source: the wildlife. Within days of completing the initial planting, I started seeing species that hadn't been in the neighborhood for years. A pair of great blue herons took up residence in the shallow water areas, and families of red-winged blackbirds nested in the cattails. Wood ducks began stopping by during their migration, and I even spotted a family of muskrats that had moved in from the state park. The sight of wild animals thriving 50 yards from suburban backyards was exactly what I'd hoped to achieve. The success of the project drove Pamela to increasingly desperate measures. She'd been monitoring my progress from her kitchen window, and the sight of wildlife in her perfectly controlled neighborhood seemed to trigger something primal in her need for dominance. Her first counterattack came in the form of anonymous complaints to the county health department, claiming that my wetland was creating a public health hazard due to standing water and uncontrolled animal population. When the health inspectors arrived for their investigation, they found a thriving ecosystem that exceeded all safety and environmental standards, but Pamela's complaints kept coming. The breakthrough moment came on a Tuesday morning when I was doing routine maintenance on the boardwalk. I'd installed trail cameras around the perimeter of the property, partly for research purposes and partly to document any potential vandalism. What I captured instead was Pamela herself, creeping around the edges of my wetland at dawn with a bottle of what appeared to be pesticide. The footage was crystal clear. Pamela pouring chemicals into the water where I'd planted sensitive native species, then quickly retreating back to her house. The irony was breathtaking. The woman who'd claimed to be protecting the community from environmental hazards was literally poisoning a conservation project. But what made it even better was that Pamela had unknowingly committed a federal crime. Dumping chemicals in a protected wetland was a violation of the Clean Water Act, punishable by significant fines and potential criminal charges. I had her dead to rights, and the evidence was so clear that even the most sympathetic judge couldn't overlook it. I spent that afternoon making copies of the video footage and preparing a detailed report for the appropriate authorities. The County Environmental Office, the State Fish and Wildlife Department, and the federal EPA all received copies of the evidence, along with documentation of the damage to the restoration project. Within 48 hours, Pamela was facing investigations from 3 different government agencies, and the story had been picked up by the local news. The media attention was exactly what I'd hoped for, but not for the reasons you might expect. Instead of focusing on the legal drama, the news coverage highlighted the success of the wetland restoration project and its benefits to the community. The local TV station did a feature story about urban conservation efforts, interviewing residents who'd been enjoying the wildlife viewing opportunities. The newspaper ran an editorial praising community-led environmental initiatives and criticizing HOA overreach. Suddenly, my project wasn't about wetland restoration, it had become a symbol of grassroots environmental activism. The shift in public opinion was dramatic and immediate. Neighbors who'd been avoiding me for weeks started stopping by to see the wetland and ask questions about the wildlife. Children from the elementary school began coming by with their parents to watch the herons and learn about native plants. The community college asked if they could install an educational kiosk to help visitors understand the ecological importance of wetland habitats. What had started as my personal revenge project had become a beloved community resource. But the real victory came when Martha organized what she called an emergency board meeting to address Pamela's conduct. Unlike Pamela's carefully orchestrated community events, this meeting was attended by residents who were genuinely concerned about HOA governance and financial accountability. Martha had spent weeks building a coalition of neighbors who were tired of Pamela's authoritarian management style, and they'd come prepared with documentation of her various abuses of power. The meeting was held in the same community center where Pamela had tried to rally opposition to my wetland project, but this time she was the one on trial. Martha presented evidence of the financial irregularities, the unauthorized use of HOA funds, and the pattern of retaliatory behavior against residents who dared to question Pamela's decisions. When the video of Pamela poisoning my wetland was shown, the reaction from the crowd was a mixture of shock and disgust. Several residents stood up to share their own stories of harassment and intimidation, painting a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond my individual case. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Even the board members who'd been Pamela's closest allies couldn't defend her actions in the face of overwhelming evidence. Pamela tried to maintain her composure as the votes were counted, but I could see her hands shaking as she realized that her reign as HOA queen was coming to an end. The woman who'd tried to drain my lake and destroy my wetland was about to lose everything she'd worked to build. As the meeting ended and people began filing out, Pamela made one last attempt to salvage her reputation. She approached me with what she probably thought was a conciliatory smile and said, "Cole, I hope you understand that everything I did was for the good of the community. Maybe we can work together going forward." The audacity was remarkable. She was trying to rewrite history even as the consequences of her actions were crashing down around her. I looked at her for a long moment, then smiled and said, "Pamela, I think your definition of community service is a little different from mine." She didn't have an answer for that. The weeks following Pamela's public humiliation brought changes to Willowbrook that I never could have imagined when I first bought my lakefront property. The investigation into her financial misconduct had expanded beyond the HOA to include her business dealings and tax filings, and federal charges were being considered for the environmental crimes. More importantly for the community, the entire HOA board structure was being reorganized under Martha's leadership, with new bylaws designed to prevent any single person from wielding the kind of authoritarian power Pamela had accumulated. But the most satisfying development was what happened to my original lake. The county environmental office had been so impressed with my wetland restoration project that they'd commissioned a study of the entire watershed, including the drained lake that had started this whole conflict. The study concluded that Pamela's flood risk claims had been completely fabricated, and that the lake had served as a crucial stormwater management system for the entire area. Without it, the neighborhood was at significantly higher risk of flooding during heavy rains. The irony was beautiful in its completeness. Pamela had drained my lake to prevent flooding, but her actions had made flooding more likely. The county recommended immediate restoration of the lake as a public safety measure and offered to fund the project through an emergency environmental remediation grant. Within 6 months of being drained by HOA vote, my lake was being refilled by government order, with full legal protection against future interference. The restoration of the lake, combined with the success of my wetland project, had transformed the entire character of the neighborhood. What had once been a sterile suburban development was becoming a model of integrated urban habitat management. The State Park Service had extended protected status to include both the lake and wetland areas, creating a wildlife corridor that attracted species from throughout the region. Birdwatching groups began organizing regular visits, and the community college had established a permanent field research station. The educational impact was something I'd never expected but deeply appreciated. Local schools began bringing students to study the ecosystem, and I found myself giving impromptu lectures about wetland ecology and urban conservation. The project had become a living classroom that demonstrated how human communities could coexist with natural systems rather than simply displacing them. Children who'd grown up in suburban isolation were learning to identify native plants, track wildlife, and understand the complex relationships that make ecosystems function. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the community itself. The shared experience of being manipulated by Pamela had brought neighbors together in ways that years of HOA events had never achieved. People were talking to each other again, sharing concerns and solutions rather than simply complying with administrative directives. The new HOA board operated with transparency and accountability that had been completely absent under Pamela's regime. Martha had been elected as the new HOA president, and her first official act was to repeal all of Pamela's punitive regulations and replace them with community-developed guidelines that served residents' needs. The oppressive sign restrictions were eliminated, the arbitrary landscaping requirements were replaced with native plant incentives, and the financial management was restructured with multiple oversight mechanisms to prevent future embezzlement. The legal resolution of Pamela's crimes was equally satisfying. She'd been forced to pay full restitution for the misappropriated HOA funds, plus substantial fines for the environmental violations. The criminal charges had been reduced to misdemeanors in exchange for a guilty plea, but she'd been banned from serving on any homeowners association board for 10 years. More practically, the legal costs and restitution payments had forced her to sell her house and move out of Willowbrook entirely. I was standing on my restored dock, watching herons fish in the evening light, when Martha walked over with 2 cups of coffee and a satisfied smile. "You know," she said, settling into the chair I'd set up for visitors, "when you first moved here, I thought you were going to be trouble. Turns out you were exactly the kind of trouble this place needed." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the wildlife that had returned to claim its habitat. The documentary about the whole conflict had been completed and was scheduled to air on the regional PBS station the following month. The filmmaker had titled it Draining Democracy, and it used our community's experience to explore broader issues of HOA abuse and environmental justice. I'd been hesitant about participating initially, but Martha had convinced me that sharing our story might help other communities dealing with similar problems. The final twist came when I received a letter from the new property owners who'd bought Pamela's house. They were a young couple with 2 small children, and they'd specifically chosen Willowbrook because of the wildlife habitat and community environmental programs. They wanted to thank me for creating the wetland project that had attracted them to the neighborhood, and they'd asked if I could help them design native landscaping for their yard. Standing on my dock that evening, looking across the restored lake toward the thriving wetland where Pamela's house used to cast its shadow, I realized that revenge had been far less satisfying than restoration. I hadn't won because I was right, although I was. I hadn't won because I was smarter than Pamela, although that hadn't hurt. I'd won because I had been patient enough to let her destroy herself and stubborn enough to keep building something positive while she was busy tearing things down. The lake was full again, the wetland was thriving, and the community was stronger than it had been in years. Children were learning to love nature instead of fear it. Neighbors were working together instead of competing with each other, and Willowbrook had become the kind of place I'd originally hoped to find when I bought my property. Sometimes the best victory isn't defeating your enemy, it's making your enemy irrelevant by creating something better than they ever could. Do you think Pamela will ever dare to come back? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think should happen if she does. And if this story inspired you to stand up to your own HOA tyrant, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.